Happy Wednesday, Year 10. It's Miss Deutsch here. You might recognize my voice. If not, that's my introduction. I'm Mrs. Deutsch. I'm here to deliver our remote learning for today. Obviously, you are in college on Thursday, so you only have one day, so 2 sessions of remote learning with English to go. What I would ask is that you will need to get yourself a piece of paper and a pen, or whether you can multitask and kind of have this screen reduced and a Word document open so that you can record some of the work we're going to ask you to do today. Now, we are going to take advantage of the fact that usually we have like an introductory lesson that has to download some information, some key information about the Year 10 course. So in terms of note-taking, some of our responses are what we're going to call thinking out loud on paper. So yeah, we're going to encourage you to write and respond. But this information as well is about introducing you to the course and what the next 2 years is going to look like. I will just say in a minute, you might want to pause and just get yourself a paper and a pen set up to take those notes. But also, I don't want to detract from the fact that when you meet your English teachers in person, later this week, that they will also go through their own clear expectations for how we learn in Year 10, our expectations on how you use books and class time and home time. But we're going to go straight in with me in our session today to kind of welcome you to Year 10 English, to give you a subject overview. Now, guys, if you look on the board, you will see that we have English language in purple and English literature in yellow. Now, you will end up sitting potentially, or they've said that the exam season will be back to normal in 2023. So you will sit 2 English language papers and 2 English literature papers. So across those 4 exams in total, you will come out with and achieve 2 English grades, a grade for English language and a grade for English literature. Now, when we think about grades, we are in the numerical system now. And we know that most colleges and employers are looking for a grade 4 to 5 as a minimum. Okay, so we are now starting that journey at the beginning of Year 10 that will end with a real tangible in your hand result, a grade that you will take to college, to sixth form applications, to employers. So there is real value in what we are achieving. Now, in order to best prepare you for those end of year exams, we tend to divide the years, Year 10 and Year 11, in 2. So although I'm going to talk to you about the big subject overview, I would just like at this stage to say we focus primarily in Year 10 on English literature. And it's highlighted here in yellow because when you're in class with us this week, your English teacher will give you a lovely yellow book. We use the yellow book to keep all of your English notes. And then in Year 11, you get a lovely purple book for your language. So we're already setting you up to organize your notes and to recognize that purple will be tested in one group of exams and your yellow book content, your English literature content, in another. Okay, if you need to pause at this point, you can get yourself a piece of paper and a pen. So, although we are looking forward to Year 11, just as a quick overview, your English language content, the knowledge that you need, is the knowledge to be able to read different types of texts. It says here fiction and non-fiction. So one of your English language exams has a fiction focus. So you will read an extract from a story and answer and respond in different formats, different question formats, to show your understanding, your comprehension of that text. You will also be asked under exam conditions to produce your own writing, which is what we call a creative and transactional response. So you'll be asked to write a descriptive response to a stimulus, often a prompt such as a picture. In your English literature, which is what we primarily focus on in Year 10, we are positioning, we need to read and respond to different types of texts. So guys, we can make this really clear, this isn't going to change. In Year 10, you are going to read Blood Brothers. Now, this is our starting text. Although we're doing a general introductory lesson today, you will very quickly begin to focus in on our first key text, Blood Brothers. After Blood Brothers, in line with Christmas, we look at A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. We then study Macbeth. And we end with a return to the poetry anthology that you've already begun. At the end of year 9, you've already done some of the poetry content, but there's also an unseen poetry element as well. So our primary focus for English literature, Blood Brothers, A Christmas Carol, Macbeth, and poetry. We can encourage you are able to buy your own copy of these set literature texts. The benefits of that mean that you can make your notes, you can record within them, you can reread them as many times as you like. However, if that's not a possibility, you can also be given a set text to borrow in class. Okay, so English literature then, that's our focus, that's where we're going to this year. But I would just like to remind you of something that creates a bridge from year 9 into year 10. Now, when we think about year 10, we start with this focus on literature. And we've already encountered in year 9 examples of literature texts. As I said, we just ended year 9 with some poetry. We looked right back at the beginning of year 9 at Greek tragedy. We've looked at extracts from Victorian literature. I'm thinking of Jane Eyre and The Mad Woman in the Attic. We've read Sherlock Holmes. So we've already, through our experience in year 9, been introduced to great literature, with the idea that that literature, those novels that we've read, the poems that we've looked at, the extracts we've considered, are designed to entertain us, but also to make us think. All of the texts that you have studied in year 9, but also that we go on to study in year 10, will in some way present characters, events, and ideas that have been created to represent aspects of what it is to be human. One of the unifying themes, motives of all writers is that exploration of what it means to be human, to ask questions about humanity, to ask questions about what it means to be human. Why do we do the things we do? What motivates us? How do humans think? And those are the questions that writers come at and think about time and time again in their texts. The text we study will also offer us insight into the bigger aspects of society. So absolutely, we're looking at texts that tell us what it means to be human, but we recognize that all humans are social creatures. We're relational, aren't we? We make relationships with each other, with others. We relate to society. We have to relate to the world around us. No man is an island. Yeah, so we are going to encounter in the text that we read questions about what it means to be human, but also then what it means to be a human that has to live, function, relate to a bigger world around them, to their society. And this again poses big questions. And writers will always provide a window into their world, into the world around them, and often with the view to challenge us as readers, as an audience, to somehow see in a new way, to change our perspective, to open up our eyes so that we might see wonderful things in the world around us. We also recognize that more than just that individual moment of seeing the world in a new way, that some literature has genuinely contributed to changing social attitudes and beliefs. In other words are really powerful. And if you put those words together in the structure of a story, in the shape of a poem, in such a way that it has real resonance and impact on the readers, you can actually really change society. Now, we're a little bit desensitized. Yep, we're a little bit jaded. We're so used to being able to read books, to read, and that skill of reading that we take it for granted. But books really did change the world. Books really did contribute to changing social attitudes and beliefs. So through the art of storytelling, something we take for granted, we all tell each other stories all the time, don't we? But actually, real literature could tell such powerful stories that they challenged us to see the world through different eyes. They actually made real change. So we've mentioned we're going to study at Christmas, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. That novel was impactful. It actually resulted in the laws around child work, so the child labour force and how children were forced to work. It actually changed laws. It created a change in society. Shakespeare created changes in the language, the vocabulary, the attitudes, the beliefs of people based on his plays. When we think back to the poetry we've just studied, when we were looking at the World War II poems, sorry, the World War I and II poems, you know, you are a man sat in a trench. Your life is like hanging in the balance. Why do you pick up your pen and write a poem? Because it has the power to change. It has the power to change how people would think about the war. It would show them the truth. So I love that about literature. Okay, so all of the texts we're going to look at in some way will encourage you to see society, people in a new way. So that's where we're going to. But we're also just going to recap, okay? And we're going to remind ourselves of something we looked at in the beginning of year 9. So far, guys, you've just had to listen to me, but we are going to answer some questions in a minute. Now, we're going to focus particularly as a running theme across several of our texts on this concept of tragedy. So we're going to look at Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, poetry. We are looking at Blood Brothers. Now, all of these in some way link to this idea of tragedy. And you may or may not remember, we began year 9 by looking at the history of tragedy. And we went right back to Greek theatre. And tragedy was one of the 3 genres of drama that made up Greek theatre. There was the satires, there was comedies, and there was tragedy. So tragedy was a type of theatre. Now, tragedy was a branch of drama that treats in a serious and dignified style the sorrowful or terrible events encountered or caused by a heroic individual. That's a really wordy definition of tragedy, but it gets the key ideas. It reminds us of those key ideas. So tragedy is a branch of drama that treats carefully, that carefully considers in a serious way and with a sense of dignity some of the terrible and sad events that can happen to people, that can be caused by people. And it gets us to look at those terrible events. Tragedy, in a more precise way, refers to a work of art. So that could be a literature text, a poem, a play that probes with high seriousness. So it's that word serious again. In other words, it carefully considers questions about the role of man in the universe. So tragedy is big. Yep, tragedy, go big or go home. It deals with the big questions. It really does get us thinking about the big questions. It carefully considers what is going on in the world. And it's a type of play, it's a type of text that deals with tragic, so sad events, and it has had a happy ending. If you remember from Greek tragedy, what are our potential endings? What are those scenes of suffering that the play leads us to? Death, exile, suicide, banishment. They do not take us to happy places. And especially with certain branches of tragedy, it tends to focus on the downfall of the main character. So you might remember from year 9, we talked about the tragic hero, that hubris, that pride, that arrogance that leads to his downfall. Now, all of the texts that we do encounter in our year 10 literature course, actually we could argue in some way link to these themes and ideas. Not going to lie, not all of the texts we look at are plays. We look at 2 plays, we look at 1 novel or novella, and we look at some poetry. So we are looking to track really across those texts this idea of terrible events, this idea of sad events, this idea of unhappy endings, unhappy resolutions, this idea of characters undergoing change. Now, not all of the texts fit neatly into this definition of tragedy, but they do link to it in some way. So guys, what I'd like you to do now, I'm just going to show you some questions. Okay, I'm just going to reveal them one at a time. Then I'm going to ask you to pause the video, okay, and to answer those questions in your own words. So, what was tragedy one of? So look back, all the answers are on this page. So you might say tragedy was one of the 3 genres of drama. Okay, so what was tragedy one of? How many genres of theatre are there? Does tragedy treat events in a serious or funny way? What questions are asked in a tragedy? What happens to the main character in a tragedy? So guys, press pause there. Now really, we want you to write your answers to these questions. But we've got 3, 4, 5 questions. But if you're still here after about 6 minutes, it's too long. Just finish the question you're on and then move on. Okay, guys, so I'll see you on the other slide. Okay, lovely. So what was tragedy one of? 3 genres of drama. How many genres are there? 3. Does tragedy treat events in a serious or funny way? Brilliant. Serious. What questions are asked in tragedy? Oh, the role of man in the universe. So what's our place in the universe? Where do we fit? What's our purpose, our plan? And what happens to main characters in a tragedy? They have a downfall and they have an unhappy ending and they die. They suffer. It's all a bit sad. So for us then, we've got the history of tragedy. We started in year 9 with that history. And we recognize that there are 4 key periods and locations, however, that show something changing to tragedy. So for us, we looked at the beginning of year 9 at Greek tragedy. And we looked at the Oedipus and what happened to him. So that took us right back to the origins of tragedy. So tragedy originated in Attica in Greece in the 5th century BCE. So that's like a lot of years ago, isn't it? So that's about 2,500 years ago because we're 2021 now. So that's a long time ago. We then see that actually tragedy it's a bit like musical genres. Something's really popular, then it disappears, then it comes back. Recently, my sister's been trying to get me to listen to country and Western music. She thinks it's undergoing a revival. I'm not convinced. But we know that we have rises in popularity and dips. So the next time something quite dramatic happens to tragedy is in England between about 1558 to 1625. And this is where Shakespeare and some of his contemporaries, so it wasn't just Shakespeare, but he's our main focus, hello Macbeth, actually began to change tragedy. So there were elements of the Greek tragedy that was set up in the 5th century BC, such as looking at man's place in the universe, the downfall, the scene of suffering, the reversal, all those elements we looked at in year 9. But actually Shakespeare does something slightly different. Now, Shakespeare begins to focus on the individual and he begins to question. So a lot of Greek tragedy looks to blame outside influences for people's behavior. So it questions the role of fate. A lot of what happens in Greek tragedy is accidental. So misunderstandings, misfortunes, accidents. Now, Shakespeare, if you like, is often cited as being a great psychologist. He was a psychologist who really explored in his tragedies and plays human psychology. In other words, the internal stuff, what's going on in the inside of people, not just what's going on the outside. So one of the changes we see with tragedy during this period is much more of a focus on the internal suffering, the internal choices. And that debate, that conflict between how much are we responsible for what happens to us, how much is beyond our control. So we see a resurgence in popularity in England. The tragedy was suddenly really popular again, thanks to Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Then the next change we see is in the 17th century. Stuff happens to tragedy in France, but not going to lie, we don't cover that. So we're just going to recognize that something happened to tragedy in France in the 17th century, but then we're going to bump ahead. Okay, and then we see another change in tragedy and the way tragedy was played out in Europe and America during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So again, tragedy changes again. Now, what this tells us is like fashion, okay, genres change and adapt. If something's going to remain relevant, it often has to change and adapt to keep up with the changing times. And we do look at a very modern play. I love it. This is going to be your first play this week, guys. Blood Brothers. Now, Blood Brothers is in many ways not a tragedy. At first, you might start to read and think, this isn't a tragedy. However, you can see Willie Russell, the writer of Blood Brothers, actually being influenced by tragedy. And you could argue that Blood Brothers is something we see with modern texts where we call hybrid. So you take strands of tragedy and strands of comedy and strands of other types of texts. Now, even Christmas Carol has tragic elements in it. There is suffering, there is injustice, there is pain, there is a character who, because of his own actions, kind of undergoes a downfall. But what I love about Christmas Carol is, whereas traditional tragedy takes us to a sad ending, we've got a lovely redemptive narrative. So not all of them are going to tightly agree with everything we know about tragedy, but that's the beauty of literature. It shows how things adapt and change. Now, we are then just, and I could have put here Christmas Carol, Blood Brothers, Macbeth. I was just talking to you about them. Even our poems, they reflect the tragedy, the sad events of war. So there are tragic elements in there. Now, guys, just going to give you a minute again to pause. So this time it's a quick checking knowledge. You can see some of these are short answers. Okay, so just write down number 1 to 4 in your book. Press pause and just write down your answers. And when you're ready, join me on the other slide and we'll look at what you came up with. Okay, so number 1 is Greek theatre over 250 years old or 2,500 years old. How many genres of Greek theatre were there? 1, 2, or 3? What T is the genre that gives careful and serious consideration to what it means to be human? And then can you arrange and match these 4 places and periods in the correct order? So we've got France, Greece, England, Europe, and America. So which date would you match to France? The 19th to 20th century, 5th century BC, 17th century, or 1558 to 1625? Now, guys, the magic of YouTube, magic of slides, you can look back at the information if you need to. Okay, I'll see you in a minute. Right, guys, are you ready for the answers? As if by magic. There we go. So Greek theatre, so this is where tragedy started. It's 2,500 years old at least. And tragedy was one of 3 genres. Okay, so it's one of 3. And our answer is, what T is the genre that gives careful consideration? And that is our tragedy, the genre of tragedy. Then tragedy began then in Greece in the 5th century BC. Then it had a resurgence in England in 1558 to 1625. We bypass France in the 17th century because it doesn't really apply to the text we're looking at. And then we have a sense of the Europe and American 19th to 20th century adaptations of tragedy. People like the tragic. So it stays popular, but it gets reinvented over time to make it relevant to a new zeitgeist, a new era, a new way of thinking. Okay, so just give yourself a tick. Brilliant. Okay, so each period then saw the evolution at each time of a focus and emphasis that was unique to that time and place. But all of the texts retained elements of the template established in Greece. So all of the texts we look at and all those time periods place really careful consideration of ideas, reflecting the importance of making sense of how to be human and how to survive. And all of the texts involve the entire what we call community, the audience, the readership, in questioning and exploring common anxieties and worries. In other words, tragedy is all about getting us to look at what we're most afraid of. Tragedy is almost like holding up a mirror to our fears and our anxieties and making us look at them and think through them in a safe way. So, as the Greeks developed it, the tragic form raised big questions about human existence. It asked questions such as, well, why must humans suffer? Why must humans be forever torn and wrestling between the seemingly irreconcilable forces of good and evil? Why do good people sometimes do evil things? Can evil people ever be good, ever have elements of goodness? Can a person be both good and evil? Can a person choose, or is a person born one way or the other? How does a person get caught torn between what we call freedom and the necessity for sometimes like control or order? How can a person be both truthful and then lie and be torn between deceit? It also gets us to question, though, where does suffering come from? So is suffering outside of oneself, in blind chance? In other words, do I suffer because just bad things happen to me by accident? You know, I'm walking down the street, I trip over. That was accidental. Is suffering because other people design it so? In other words, the evil design or plan of others. Do I suffer because somebody is planning to intimidate me, be cruel to me, that they have evil designs to dominate me and be cruel and mean. Now, because of the originations of tragedy in Greek theatre, so in that Greek time, 5th century BC, was it because the gods were angry or that the gods enjoyed to watch us suffer? Remember your good old Greek mythology. Often the gods are shown to be causing suffering, either to punish humans or to test them. Now, we talked about on those changes, the way in which Macbeth and Shakespeare in that English resurgence of the tragedy did something different. And at that point, he was looking at internal psychology. Am I the reason I'm unhappy? Do I suffer because I make bad choices? Do I suffer because I'm arrogant? Do I suffer because I'm too proud to ask for help? Do bad things happen to me because I don't listen? Do bad things happen to me because of infatuation, obsession, ambition, the tendency to overreach? So ambition, if you like, actually sometimes can lead to a tendency to overreach. I'm going for something greater than I should aim for, and then I end up suffering. So we see then this inside-outside dynamic. Is suffering happening because of things outside of me and therefore outside of my control? Or is it my choices? Is it something going on inside of me? And that dynamic, that questioning of those two comes up beautifully in Macbeth. And then it asks the question, well, why is justice so elusive? In other words, why is it so hard to do the right thing? Why is it so hard to be good? Why is it so hard to treat all people fairly? Now, it just says over here some big questions. Now, this is a thinking out loud on paper moment. In other words, you can write your answer to these questions as notes. This does not need to be full sentences, but I would love you just to pause and think about these big questions. So, guys, and I don't mean to do this disrespectfully, we actually are in a terrible, painful reality because of where we live at the moment, because we're Plymouthian, aren't we? We live either into a point. Some of us live in Plymouth. There is no way we could not have known through the news, the coverage, the media, that we have a real example of human suffering and tragedy that unfolded for us over the summer. So when it says, number one, what examples of human suffering have you seen in the news, on social media, in the world around you? Starting to think about, are these questions, why do humans suffer, as a modern example? Can you think of any? So in a minute, you can just write down a few ideas as I talk, or you can answer them in a minute. So what examples of human suffering have you seen in the news, on social media, in the world around you? Number two, why do people do, in your opinion, good and bad things? So just as an example, it's like, why do you think politicians have to lie? Why do they lie? Why can they not always tell us the truth? Why do powerful people sometimes lie? Why do you think people can't tell us the truth? Now, remember, guys, this is thinking out loud on paper. There's no right or wrong. This is just you thinking that actually what we'll see with this is that, yes, absolutely, these questions that tragedy asks still are relevant in 2021. What about this one? Do you think bad things happen because of accidents, or do you think it's people's choices? Where would you put yourself on that line? Do you think bad things happen accidentally, whether we want to call it fate, circumstance, whatever word we want to put to it, really? Do you think things really happen to us that are beyond our control, or do you think it's all about the choices we make? Or is it somewhere in between? And just for that last one, am I responsible for what happens to me? If you suffer, is it because it's your responsibility, something's happened to you? So guys, this is a moment, like if we were in class, it would be lovely to hear your feedback, but I would like you just to think about these questions, okay? And then we've got 2 more activities, and then our lesson's done. So all of these is to get us thinking of this common thread that runs through our literature text from year 10. These questions about suffering, about what makes humans good or evil, truthful or deceitful, what causes sufferings, and why is it so hard to treat people fairly? Okay, so do your thinking out loud paper. Again, I would say give yourself about 4 or 5 minutes. If you're still working on these questions after about 4 minutes, don't worry about answering all of them. Remember, we're thinking out loud on paper, so it could be notes rather than big full answers. Okay? Right. So obviously we don't have the means to be able to hear each other's answers for those thinking out loud questions, but they should all lead us to this key concept. Now, again, like tragedy is going to be a key key concept that runs across all of year 10 texts in some way. We will see suffering in the text that we read. We will see downfall of character. We will see restoration of character, but we will also tie that journey of tragedy to justice and social injustice. So these are some really important concepts that keep coming up that we will return to. So by establishing this as our vocabulary right from the start, it's going to help us understand some big ideas. So in a minute, I am going to ask you to write down the definitions of these keywords, okay? Just so you're beginning to have a record. Guys, if you write it on a piece of paper and then write it into your yellow book again, that's just revision. That's returning to a key idea, rewriting it, representing it in a new way. That's revision. So doing this twice is not a waste of time. So let's have a look at this first word, justice and just. So they're linked, okay? But in terms of their roots, they're both from the word just, which is from the Latin jus, which means the law and what is right. So justice then, the sense of justice, the Justice League, is the quality of being just, a sense of fairness, of people getting what they deserve. So this sense of justice sets up the idea that what we expect within society is fairness. We expect fairness, people to be treated fairly. We expect society to work on the grounds that people get what they deserve. So when we talk about justice, and we see, sometimes we can visualize the image of the woman with the scales, that sense of fairness, of people getting what they deserve. And linked to that then is this concept of being just, to be just. So somebody that is just is behaving according to what is morally right and fair. So guys, you can be writing down justice and just as I'm talking this through. Now, already we could argue these definitions become problematic because who gets to decide what is morally right and fair? Now, we are in 2021. We are living in the UK, the United Kingdom, which some people would argue is part of a Western civilization. You know, we're a Western culture. We talk about Western civilization. So our definition of what is morally right and fair is often tied historically, ironically, to the Greek concepts of maybe democracy and that idea of, well, it's right and fair to vote in people into power. It's right and fair to treat people a particular way. But we also have to recognize that our sense of justice and what it means to be just is also tied into a Christian ideology. Yeah, so often when we think about what's morally right and fair, you know, who decided that it's morally right not to steal? That was a decision society made historically and set into if you like, into law, into the way that we are taught, into the way that society rewards those who don't steal and punishes those that do. But actually, who got to decide what's morally right or fair? Now, to be honest, that's too big a question for here, but it's just a nice one to have in your head, isn't it? But we do expect and understand that there is this line, the standard that is set that says on this side of the line is the things that are right and fair, and on this side of the long line are the things that are wrong and unfair. So when we talk about just, we are looking at behavior that falls into the category of what we think is right and good behavior and fair. If you behave, so if you don't steal, you're doing what's morally right, and that's fair. If you steal, you've gone into the morally wrong and unfair category. And taking it back to that sense of justice, people get what they deserve. So if you are doing what's right and fair, you're going to be rewarded, you're going to be happy, society is going to recognize you. If you steal, potentially there's a punishment, a judicial punishment. In other words, you might go to prison or you might be arrested, but in some ways there would be you would get what you deserve. Now, doesn't that sound lovely? But as those ideas from Greek theatre just told us, actually Greek theatre, so even 2,500 years ago, people were saying it's actually really hard to get things that are just. It's really hard to create a society where everybody is treated fairly, where everybody does the right thing. So the question becomes, why is it so hard for us humans to treat each other fairly? Why is it so hard for us to be right and kind and good to one another? And that's exactly not just what Greek theatre was looking at, but what Blood Brothers is questioning. Why is it so hard for two brothers to be treated right and fairly? Why did they get treated differently? Why is it so hard for Macbeth to do what's morally right and fair? So all of the texts look at these questions. Okay, and into that then we also have the bigger concepts of what we call social injustice, which is where a person or group within society is treated unfairly. And this is where people are not getting what they deserve, and instead they're often discriminated against. So they're treated unfairly, they're treated or given in a way that disadvantages them. And sadly, what we see across the text that we study, that there are some parts of society, such as the law, the education system, the government system, the money system, that even carry out unfair practices that perpetuate those injustices, that keep them going. You know, why is it that somebody might be born right now, you're watching this, there's a baby born. Now that baby is already born into a certain part of society. They might be born rich. They might be born white. They might be born a girl. They might be born with a disability. And immediately that child is going to be part of a society that, based on certain characteristics, are going to be treated fairly and going to get a lot of advantage. Whereas some might be born in ways that means they end up discriminated against. Sexism means that some girls are discriminated against because of their gender. Racism means that some people are discriminated against because of the colour of their skin. Ageism, some people are discriminated against because of their age. And there are certain things in society that keep that going. So this lovely word, perpetuate, love it. It means to keep that going. And sometimes it's the big things that we think should know better. You know, the law, police should know better, but they can often keep going this idea that you get to mistreat somebody because of where they live, or because of the colour of their skin, or because of their age. That is social injustice, okay? And it's often linked then, so how do we take social injustice back to tragedy? Because social injustice then, if people are being treated unfairly and in a way that's wrong, it causes suffering. So if we think one of those key questions that tragedy asks us, well, where does suffering come from? Well, suffering often comes from injustice. That when people are treated in a wrong way, in a way that is morally wrong, when people are treated unfairly, it creates injustice. Now, in the text we look at, you might be looking at a character who is treated unfairly and in a way that is morally wrong. Or it could be a character who is treating others unfairly, who by their actions is doing something morally wrong themselves. Now, this is our last bit for today. So hopefully you've written down justice and just and what social injustice is. I was talking and maybe you could have been writing as I did it. So our very last task, okay, is just to see, can we apply these ideas, okay? This idea that social injustice is where people are treated unfairly and in a way that's morally wrong, to the text we're going to study this year. So here's a reminder, we're looking at Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Blood Brothers, and we've already looked at some of the poems from Power in Conflict. Now you have to match the right definition to the text. So one of these four is going to talk about social injustice from the point of view that you are going to meet a character, a man who is motivated by fear, so much so that he idealizes, I love that word, it means he worships money. And because he's so in love with money, he ends up neglecting the poor and needy in society. So he ends up treating others unfairly and in a morally wrong way because he's afraid and focuses on money. Now, does that sound like a summary of Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Blood Brothers, or Power in Conflict? Now, if you want, you can wait to see the other definitions to help you do the matching. We're also going to look at a text then, or a group of poems in this case, that span several wars and expose the unfair treatment of soldiers. So we could argue that there are the poems that we've studied that actually expose the unfair treatment of soldiers. There's a sense of injustice for some of the experiences that we've seen. So which would that go with? Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Blood Brothers, or Power and Conflict? Okay, now this one. A man corrupted by ambition murders an innocent king. Ooh, Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Blood Brothers, Power and Conflict. What do you know? If you don't know which, you might have to Google it. Okay, so which of these texts can be summed up? There's so much more to these texts and these summaries, by the way, but it's just a nice little way to end today. As a man corrupted by ambition murders an innocent king. So this is where somebody is being treated in a way that's morally wrong. And it's going to create a whole chain reaction of suffering because of this action. Which would you put that one with? Now, last, one of these texts that we're going to study this year focuses on a brother separated from his twin at birth, and he is treated unfairly because he is poor. So, guys, that's just a way to bring this concept of social injustice right into year 10, the lit text we're going to study. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. Just write down the text name, so Macbeth, and which definition you'd put it with. Okay? And then we're going to look at the answers together. And then that is, ta-da, you're done. Okay? So, next one to look at the answers. Okay, magic, social injustice, where people are treated unfairly and in a way that's morally wrong, and that causes suffering that then is explored across the text we studied. So, A Christmas Carol, here it is. It's a man motivated by fear. Now, A Christmas Carol, love it. Ebenezer Scrooge, motivated by fear. Now, we look in depth at what he's afraid of, but he's really afraid of being poor. He's afraid of being alone. And he's afraid of the world. And so out of a place of fear, he begins to idealize money. I love that expression, which means he begins to worship money. He begins to build an altar to money. He begins to build his life around the pursuit and the gathering of money. And in doing so, he neglects the poor and needy in society. He begins to mistreat people. He begins to alienate people. He begins to treat people as disposable. And we see in A Christmas Carol that unfair treatment of others leads not only to their suffering, but also to the suffering of Ebenezer Scrooge. And he has to be changed from being morally wrong to morally right. Okay, so if you got that one right, give yourself a tick. Okay. Oh, now guys, we've done this. We've looked at the war poems. There are more poems that we come to at the end of year 10. But look at this. All of the poems we looked at were the poems that spanned the wars. They were the war poems. And the unifying theme across most of them was that these poems were looking to expose the unfair treatment and experience of soldiers. So there was a sense of social injustice, a sense in which society really kind of failed some of these soldiers, treated them unfairly, that some decisions that were made around where the soldiers should go and how they should be treated were morally wrong. Brilliant. Oh, now this one, Macbeth, okay? After Christmas, we've got a little warm-up through Blood Brothers and A Christmas Carol, but then we come to the big bad, Shakespeare. Love it. Now, Macbeth, at its heart, is a play about a man, a good man, corrupted by ambition, who begins to treat others unfairly, who begins to make very quickly hugely morally wrong decisions that cause his own suffering and the suffering of others. So Macbeth then, it starts with that ambition that leads him to murder an innocent king. And this whole chain events of suffering are set in motion. Excellent. And last but not least then, so Blood Brothers, this is where we're going to start this week, guys. It's going to tell us the story of two twins, really. But in particular, out of the twins, one of the brothers, separated from his twin at birth, is treated unfairly because he is poor. His experience is one of unfair treatment, discrimination, injustice because he is poor. Now, guys, you've done a really good job listening. Now, this is a double Wednesday. Hey, on a Wednesday of week 1, you have 2 hours of English. Now, there is, I believe, having a little mental block, sorry, a survey that we also want you to fill in. So really, this possibly is going to have taken you longer than an hour because you've got the 2 hours to fill in, but maybe not the complete 2 hours because we would love you to do the survey. Okay, we're really looking forward to seeing you in person. We can't wait to work with you this year. And it's going to be glorious because I think we're going to be back in the class. No need to do too much online learning, no need to bubble, but as we love to teach, face to face, and just introducing you to these amazing texts. So guys, we look forward to seeing you this week.